Alrighty, welcome back. Can you hear me? Hey, this is exciting. Can't imagine how happy I am that Dr. Curry's here. So, all right. So, instead of reading to you Dr. Tommy Curry's biography, which is included in the conference program, I want to briefly say a few words about the relevance of his academic work today, particularly his latest book. Let me be emphatic. You must buy and read The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood. Why? Because it is one of the most important books I have read recently. With The Man Not, Curry did not just author the 2018 winner of the American Book Award, but he also inaugurated an entire field by the name of Black Male Studies, which is described as follows. Black male studies is an interdisciplinary field dedicated to exploring the various developmental trajectories and the vulnerabilities, racial, sexual, economic, of black men and boys in the United States and abroad. To give you a sense of the book's significance, The Man Not signals a paradigm shift, or a scientific revolution, to use these terms from Thomas Kuhn's. In The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Kuhn argues that scientific revolutions, or non-cumulative developmental episodes in which an older paradigm is replaced in whole or in part by an incompatible new one, are inaugurated by a growing sense that an existing paradigm has ceased to function adequately in the exploration of an aspect of nature to which that paradigm itself had previously led the way. In both political and scientific development, the sense of malfunction that can lead to crisis is prerequisite to revolution. In his book, Curry shows us that the paradigms of feminism and post-structuralism, or what he labels theory with a capital T, have ceased to function adequately in the exploration of black male vulnerability. On the one hand, feminism as a paradigm is premised on the primacy of sex over race, which results in a commonly held assumption among theorists that black males are somehow privileged along the axis of patriarchy because of their maleness. This assumption, of course, denies the historical facticity of slavery, Jim Crow, and the new Jim Crow. It also denies any empirical evidence to the contrary, that is, experiences of black male vulnerability. Curry's conceptualization of black males as man-nots accomplishes at least two things. One, it delinks black maleness from the construct of patriarchy, which in the context of the US is specifically a function of white supremacy. For Curry, black feminism internalizes some of the racist logics of first-wave feminism, like the ideological fantasy figure of the black rapist. Curry contests black feminism, particularly intersectional theory, as a paradigm not because he doesn't believe in the equal rights of women, but because of feminism's inherent anti-black male logic, an inherent logic to racialized capitalism and settler colonialism. Two, the concept of the man-not names the reality of sexual violence that black males have been facing since the time of slavery to this day. Curry shows that black males in the US, although positioned as super predators in the political unconscious, are actually vulnerable to different kinds of violence, which render them generically disposable because they are raised bodies that are neither sexed nor gendered. Consequently, black males are not entitled to being victims of rape or domestic violence, for instance. I know these are provocative arguments. Paradigm shifts or scientific revolutions are always provocative, in a good way, I think. So in response to Curry's critiques of black feminism, I hope that in the near future, we'll see the establishment of black female studies as a field dedicated to studying black females as woman-nots. Black males and black females need to be in solidarity together in their struggle against white supremacy and racialized capitalism, which, as a matrix of domination, is dividing and conquering blacks inside and outside of academia. Solidarity amongst blacks, as instigated by their common experience with structural racism and super exploitation, is a manifestation of what Angela Davis calls an intersectionality of struggles. Now please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Tommy Curry.
First, I'm so happy to be here. It was a long flight, so forgive me for being slightly jet lagged. Let me begin by saying that the paper that I want to deliver today, ad Limen of Homini, is about the threshold, is about the proximity that racialized males have to the construct of the human. I am interested in the violence that denatures and distorts racialized male subjectivity, if we could even call it that, or rather the position that these entities hold within Western patriarchal societies. And I think that our ignorance of this grouping, of this position, this artifact in societies that ranged across centuries, stops any real decolonial or critical lens in how we actually aspire to a better society. So throughout the various literatures that comprise disciplines, the stories of racialized males, conquered men and boys, are told by their deaths. Theorists have been trained to look upon these bodies with an intuitive understanding that rotting male flesh is the natural consequence of racism and xenophobia, so much so that racialized maleness holds a symbolic referent to death. The horrors of violence imposed upon these bodies of lesser men, however, inspire no actual outrage or calls for theory. They just happen. The disproportionate homicides by police, strangers, or intimates sound no clarions. Lesser men die, and their corpses have become normal. The images of flaccid male bodies, mutilated frames and flesh become placeholders for racism, xenophobia, and the police state, so much so that there is a synonymity between death and the least powerful male body within our cultural schemas. Little else about the male victim of violence is thought to be asked or theorized beyond his corpse. Sexual victimization, dehumanization, and economic ostracism are rarely commented upon. In the Man Not Race Class genre and the Dilemmas of Manhood, I attempted to show that not only does this erasure of racialized men have an origin in the social cultural organization of Western patriarchies, but also the philosophical anthropology of Western man. In this paper, I want to introduce a new consideration, specifically the replicative function of racial endogamy, understood here not only in the sense of propagating in-group marriage and kinships, but the idea that there is a function, that there is in the function of racism and endemic to white patriarchal societies, an establishing of racialized male bodies and the justification for their extermination, not on the basis of sociobiology, but normative valuation and aspirations that society itself and the centuries-long confederation of the brute as opposite of humanity reveal. Specifically, I am reflecting upon the violence racialized men are interpreted as posing to civilization and the human writ large that make him ad liminum homini, on the threshold of the human. Theories about black males and other racialized male groups, so here I'm thinking about Latino, Jewish, Asian men, have been non-existent beyond the works asserting that their violence and disposability at the hands of other men have been the result of patriarchy and the desire of men generally to kill other men, women, and children for power. And I want to take a moment for us to really understand this. At the turn of the century in the United States, practically every group of men that entered into the white republic were deemed to both be racist and feminine. So when you think of the Yellow Peril, you're thinking about Asian men who came to the United States that were exploited for labor. They were called feminine, but nonetheless, they still were believed to be rapists. To kill these men off, they were barred from marrying any white women or bringing over any of their women. Now today, when we think about Asian men, we have the trope of effeminism, right? The trope that they're lesser men, less masculine than Anglo-Saxon white men. But we make no attempt to actually explain that. The same thing with Jewish men, lesser men, but nonetheless rapists and spreaders of pestilence. Black men, feminine, savages, but nonetheless hyper-masculine rapists, right? There is a continuity there that I think deserves reflection and theorization that doesn't seem to be a topic of conversation thus yet. Almost 2 decades ago, Adam Jones argued, quite to the contrary of the patriarchal thesis, right, that finds sexual coherence of males in their shared need for violence, that the sex-specific killings of racialized men is a purposeful and long-standing trait of imperial patriarchal societies. In Gendercide and Genocide, Jones argues that conflicts in modern patriarchal societies have specifically targeted battle-age men, civilians, who demonstrate no inclination for violence but are treated as threats regardless. As Jones states, quotes, "Non-combatant men have been and continue to be the most frequent targets of mass killing and genocidal slaughter, as well as a host of other lesser atrocities and abuses. The mass killing of males, particularly of battle-age men, has roots deep in history of conflict between human communities," end quote. Now, Jones suggests that the vulnerability of racialized men to gendercide, or gender-selective mass killing, is in fact an ignored but frequent and often defining feature of human conflict. And he theorized that it's so much so that it's a fundamental feature of human social organization that extends all the way back to antiquity. Now, what I find most fascinating about Jones's work is that he's building his theory of male gendercide from the work of the Jamaican education theorist Earl Miller, who explains that Western patriarchal societies create rigid and violent divisions between dominant group males and alien racialized males. Now, Miller's theory of male marginalization is laid out in Men at Risk and the second edition of The Marginalization of the Black Male. And these two books argue that modern patriarchal societies target racialized male groups because they are threats to the kinship relations of the dominant racial or ethnic group. According to Miller, patriarchy has historically marginalized men not covered by the covenant of kinship. Filial and fraternal bonds have always mitigated how men use power over other men who belong to the group. Throughout history, such men have been perceived as threats and treated as such. Patriarchy's treatment of such men has always been more brutish and harsh than its treatment of women. This contradictory and inconsistent feature of patriarchy, however, has been mostly ignored. Now, Miller sought to understand the function of male marginalization outside the structures of the Western metropole, a project that R.W.S. Connell has only recently begun undertaking. In Margin Becoming Center, Connell again clarified that patriarchy and gender is not based in one global pattern of male domination. And this is important because the way that we often theorize the relationship of violence and dehumanization and colonialism is to suggest that the men of the weaker races, be they black, be they Latino, be they migrant, etc., seek to imitate, right, the dominant patriarchal figure of whites. And this orientation has a long history, right, in colonial psychology, Manoni, Adler, etc. Connell is just beginning to recognize, right, that there is no universal pattern of masculinity, especially in the global South. So she writes, in fact, rather than speaking of the globalization of gender, it's more accurate to speak of the coloniality of gender. In colonization, native bodies were coerced to form plantation, pastoral, and domestic workforces. Land was seized, new power structures were built around the colonial state. These processes disrupted indigenous gender orders, often with great violence. And it is this disruption of indigenous gender orders that Miller theorized decades before Connell. Once racism and the actual social position of racialized males are placed within the purview of patriarchy, Miller finds the assertion that patriarchy is the domination of all men over women vastly inaccurate. Instead, Miller defines patriarchy as, quote, that system of reciprocal social obligations in which final authority rests with older men of the kinship collective who exercise that authority over the individual male and female members in the overall interest of the collective. Now, Miller argues that the Weberian definition of patriarchy as, quote, women and younger men being ruled by older men who are heads of household, and the feminist definition of patriarchy as a system and practices in which men dominate, oppress, and exploit women, leaves an ahistorical but nonetheless universal claim that understands patriarchy without sufficient differentiations between actual kinds of men. Miller concerns himself with the kinship relationships that patriarchal Western white societies aim to establish and maintain against alien group men. He writes, my definition of patriarchy includes genealogy, gender, and generation, and insists that the recognition of genealogy is critical if the complexities of patriarchy and gender are to be better understood. Miller theorizes that racial patriarchy stake in extending kinships as the basis of social organization and the rubric for how such groups design hierarchy is paramount. He asserts that rather than unbridled violence towards all others, i.e. people and entities that are not patriarchs, patriarchies in fact aim to define kinships biologically and culturally and rigidly protect them through violence in social institutions and practices. So violence and subordination are nuanced and specific in the work of Miller. It's not simply an antagonism between a biological male class and a biological female class. Miller is trying to get us to understand that gender and generation elements relate mainly to internal relations of the collective, while genealogy elements define as external boundaries and relations. So from one perspective, genealogy extends kinship to outside the immediate circumstance of the household or family by establishing links with other collectivities through the notion of common ancestry. And this is where we see the construction of race becoming important. At the same time, by default, it defines collectivities that are not kin. This is a critical consideration both conceptually and empirically for Miller. Miller claims that the boundaries of kinship are defined by the dominant, as defined by the dominant group, is the border of lethal violence and disposability. He writes, when patriarchal collectives interact outside boundaries where kinship could be established, whether fictive or factual, then one group had to submit to the hegemony of the other. The violence that comes to define the boundaries of racial kinship aim to not only protect existing racial or ethnic lines of descent, but exterminate the threats such entities pose to future progeny. Dominance against alien group males then is also a proleptic endeavor. And by this I mean to convey how the violence and dehumanization of a selected male outgroup not only asserts the present danger of their existence to the dominant racial group, but also how the existence of racialized males, black males, Latinos, etc., are a threat to the futurity of the group, its societal dominance, and its demographic prosperity. Current racial hierarchies sustained by violence thereby convey the aspirational nature of racism and sexual violence against these group of men to make them not viable, are dehumanized caricatures of existential beings. The prolepsis then of racial hierarchies within a given society thereby define and determine the force of their proxemics, apartheid, segregation, violence, etc. So this is why Miller comes to see practices of genocide, where one collective sought the physical elimination of the other, the killing of male captives, the castration of male captives, and the almost permanent enslavement of men, as historical outcomes of conflicts between collectives which did not share the covenant of kinship. The range of violence that these groups of men suffer under and their disproportionate selection for this kind of violence suggests for Miller that these males are differentiated by kind, or what has been taken up more recently by myself as a genre distinction. On this basis, Miller concludes that, quote, patriarchal collectives found it easier to incorporate women of non-kin groups than the men of such groups. And this is the important part, the external relationship of men of hostile collectives are as much an element of patriarchies as the internal relation with women of the kinship collective. Now, one of the schematic differences between black male studies and how we traditionally think of intersectional feminism or even the rubric of feminism is that it reorients the class antagonism. So when we generally think of the dominant racial group, we see a sexual division, man, woman, right? We're very comfortable with that. And then we say that within that dominant racial group, there is still the issue of patriarchy, where there's an antagonism between even white men and white women. The problem with this is vastly ahistorical. Even in the 19th century, the push that suffragists made about patriarchy was not that it was oppressing them, but rather that it was unbalanced, that it needed the female element to make it a more evolved aspect of white supremacy, that instead of running into the colony and killing everybody, that you could kill a few and then socialize a few and make them Christians so that they reproduce the ideas of the Anglo-Saxon race more easily than having to destroy everyone. They become better workers. They become better laborers. They become better slaves. This, however, has been excluded from the historiography of how we talk about gender development. And this is despite the fact in 19th century ethnology that inferior races were thought to be inferior precisely because they were less feminine or more feminine, right, than the patriarchal dominant race. Now, what's fascinating about this isn't simply that it's a history lesson, but it reorients how we're thinking about the relationship of racism to sex and gender. The proleptic aspect of racism suggests that not only do present inequalities tell you something about the order in that society, right, how you divvy up goods and hierarchies, but it tells you about how the racist or dominant group seeks to orient itself in the future to those societies. So I don't kill a whole bunch of black men are excluding a whole bunch of immigrants now just because of aversion and antipathy. I do it because there's a demographic product in limiting their ability to reproduce for my own race. So while Foucault may say, right, a society must be defended, that the boundaries of racism is those that the power to let live or let die, he doesn't give us a way to understand the construction or the aspirational vision that a racist society has towards the group that it exacts violence against. And this is what I think the man-not category does for us. Now, in social dominance theory, you get a fantastic descriptive account of why hierarchies exist. Sedanis and Prado argue that modern capitalistic societies organize around three primary social stratification systems. And these very much mirror the outline and taxonomy that we get from Earl Miller. I'm still trying to figure out who read who first. So the first is age system, where adults govern over children. The next is gender systems, where males tend to have more disproportionate power and status to females. And the last is arbitrary set systems, which are, quote, socially constructed and highly salient groups based on characteristics such as ethnicity, race, caste, social class, or any other socially relevant group distinction that the human imagination is capable of constructing. In these societies, age and gender tend towards fixity, given their biological designation, but have some degree of malleability, while arbitrary set systems are marked by a, quote, unusually high degree of arbitrariness, plasticity, flexibility, and situational and contextual sensitivity in determining which group distinctions are socially salient. Now, Sedanis and Prado claim that the foundational nature of age and gender stratifications make them, quote, no strangers to very brutal forms of social control. But it is those defined by their positions within socially constructed arbitrary sets who experience the most brutal forms of direct violence, especially when these arbitrary sets are defined by ethnic or racial differences. So whereas age and gender group designate power within dominant or superior groups, right? And this is the important part. That when you're talking about age or gender, you're talking about divisions within the dominant racial group. Arbitrary set systems construct the characteristics of the other. Sedanis and Prado argue that arbitrary sets are, quote, filled with socially constructed and highly salient group-based characteristics such as clan, ethnicity, estate, nation, race, caste, social class, etc. And that these distinctions are marked by asymmetrical power relations where one group is materially and or politically dominant over the other. Now, some people have had some issue with this because the consequence of this theory is the subordinate male target hypothesis. So Sedanis and Prado and other social dominance theorists argue that the popular understanding of Western patriarchy is often marked by the assumption that patriarchal violence is inherently misogynistic, violent, and threatening to the lives of women. According to Sedanis and Venegas, quote, many feminists characterize patriarchy as primarily a misogynistic structure driven by male hatred of and contempt for women. However, empirical research shows that patriarchy is primarily associated with paternalism, the intersection of discriminatory intent and positive effect rather than with misogyny. And this is important because I think that the analysis that you're getting from social dominance theory explains why, for instance, you don't have the wholesale genocide of things like white women or German women, et cetera, right? That even though there's exploitation and oppression of women that no one can deny, there is not the extermination of those women because they're needed for the reproduction of the dominant group, right? So social dominance theory does not suggest that women are not oppressed within patriarchal and capitalistic societies. Rather, following the work of Laura Betzig on the patriarchal image for violence and power within societies, Sedanis and Prado suggest that, quote, intersexual competition among males may encourage men to not only dominate women politically and economically and so control women's sexual and reproductive behavior, but also to form expropriative male coalitions against outgroup males. These activities will result both in the oppression of women and in class stratification against men. So they're recruited in the process of creating genres of men. Right? To be clear, Sedanis and Prado are not arguing that patriarchy does not discriminate or oppress women. Rather, they are arguing that the type of violence against subordinate males in these structures are different than the kinds of violence directed against subordinate females. They write, the subordinate male target hypothesis does not imply the absence of discrimination against women, for such discrimination clearly occurs and is part of the gender system of group-based social hierarchies, i.e. patriarchy. Rather, what we are suggesting is that everything else being equal, subordinate males rather than subordinate females are the primary objects of arbitrary set discrimination. In housing, incarceration, employment, and policing, social dominance theorists have found that subordinate males suffer more occurrences of outward discrimination and lethal violence than subordinate females within capitalist patriarchal societies. And what I find most interesting about this finding is that this is something that intersectional invisibility takes quite seriously. It actually concedes that when we look at modern or Western patriarchal societies, we do in fact find more empirical evidence showing the disposability, the lethal extermination, and the oppression of racialized male groups, or what they call outgroup males. The problem, however, is that intersectional invisibility, even though it concedes the empirical fact, wants to reinterpret that as saying that that is actually male privilege. That because patriarchies value men more than women and decide to exterminate men more than women, that somehow is privilege, right? I don't understand it, but maybe it's beyond my pay grade. But these kinds of theories, right, inevitably draw our attention to the kind of plasticity and indeterminacy of racial characterizations. How many different groups, how many different aspects, how many economic, political, et cetera, nuances, right, can lead to the same end, which is the death and dying of a certain group of males. What I like to do is explain briefly how black male studies makes an intervention in this and the normative replication of political antinomies. So like Miller and Sedanius, I too argue that the alien male or outgroup male, what I call the man-not, is a constitutive and persistent feature of Western patriarchal societies. Groupings of racialized men that act as depositories of savagery and entities of evil have consistently been depicted within the mythology and literatures of European ethnosciences from the 18th century with the work of Johann Lavater's Physiognomy, 19th century ethnology, and 20th century psychosociology to our present-day constructs of gender. In fact, one of the arguments that I'm making is that gender now takes on the symbolic orientation of all those previous ethnosciences. I, however, argue that these racialized male groupings are as structural as they are normative, such that social valuations tend towards the replication of the not-man antipathy through all levels of social practice, theory, and values. So it is my belief that this outgroup male category is a feature of white sociogeny, as well as a construction of negation that allows for contradiction and nullification. It is the placeholder of the brute and the savage. And one of the things that I really liked about the previous session, the previous panel, was this idea that we should be talking about the psychosocial rather than psychology. And that's, sociogeny is that. So there's a division on the evolution of, I guess, white humankind. I'm trying to figure out how to put, right, the human that was only white, so white humankind. So phylogeny is that evolutionary development that you will find between human beings, say from apes to, you know, the white human, the apex of reason, right? Ontogeny is the actual development of an individual. This was big with psychoanalysis and recapitulation theory at the end of the 19th century. And then Fanon introduced the idea of sociogeny, which is not just the description of things being socially constructed or social phenomena, but it's actually the development, the evolution of a society, the creation of constructs that give testament to the evolutionary status of the alleged superior race within a colonial context. Now, the reason that it is so groundbreaking, and people often don't understand it as such, is that it recontextualizes the way that we actually get to study the human. Imagine if we can study the human not by their unconscious desires or pleasures, right? Their hedonistic and repressed id, so to speak, which actually was based on savage black people, or savage peoples anyway, in Totem and Taboo, but I guess that's a longer paper. But nonetheless, right? But nonetheless, gives testament to what is being constructed from the minds, the culture, the economic, etc. of the oppressor. Now, I take that seriously because I think that that is what allows us to illuminate what happens in the construction of outgroup males, of not men. So this space allows for the simultaneity of negation, where black men, Jewish men, Armenian men, migrant men are constructed as hypersexual rapists and raped because they're feminine lesser men. And in my work, I call this kind of phallicistic violence that defines racialized males as both simultaneously the feminine and hypermasculine, right? That they're the same entity at the same time. And of course, that violates all rules of logic, right? You're A and not A at the same time, that shouldn't hold. But when you look at things sociogeny, right? When you look at things through a sociogenic lens, you see that that's exactly the case that we find within colonies. that I can look at black men within any colonial apparatus, even the Jim Crow South, and I can find both the stigma of the rapist and simultaneously find evidence that black men are being raped by both white women and white men. I can look into the Jewish context and the Holocaust and find the exact same thing, where Jewish boys on the run are being raped by women and in the camp raped by other men, German SS, capos, building managers, etc. So there's a predictive function in the way that these constructs are working, that there's something about the development of Western patriarchal societies and the constructs that are breeded in it, these placeholders that we see in social organization that then are represented socially in the society, where this contradiction, this negativity and nullification of male being, of racialized male being, is allowed to happen. And not so much that it's the contradiction, but we accept it within our social sphere. This is the border of the political that I want to offer a brief reflection on. So the border of the man-not, of this, what we often call the zone of non-being, runs up against the schema. And I think that while we're often allured by talking in the Afro-pessimistic language, where we love talking about non-being and wretchedness, we have not explored that threshold, right? Where the metaphysics of non-being, the vacuity of blackness, as many assert it to be, run up into the schema of being. So what is that line? How are non-beings represented within the worldview and the epistemology of those with power? And I think that this is where we have to start working out the political. So for me, the political is a place where humans act through force and power to establish or prevent specific ends. And in the political, it becomes a conduit of how our thinking about this contradictory anthropos repeats stasis under the guise of change for racial groups, a stasis that's anchored to the irreconcilable brute that is associated with the reproduction of the racial other, both in real experiential and conceptual, which means proleptic or aspirational time. Our present mode of thinking substitutes the brute, the non-human, the non-civilizational category of Western societies, anachronistically by defining violence or the threat violence has to human beings, and that which decolonizes and reconstitutes nonviolence, futurity, and non-explicit violence. And I'll explain that really quickly. I am asserting that while we can show the persistence of a man-not category from the 18th, 19th, 20th, and now 21st centuries, right, that what we do, what we end up calling for in our attempts to decolonize or be critical is the removal of all forms of violence we think are associated with coloniality. And what we do is we assign patriarchy, we assign capitalism to people who are in fact victims of patriarchy and capitalism. So our account then of black men, our Mexican men's disproportionate rates of violence, is patriarchy, their embodiment of white males. We don't understand victimization or even the relationship that this construct has to them actually causally, right, having an impetus for violence against women. So in our calls for decoloniality, what do? We don't uplift the wretched, we demonize the wretched. We ask the systems of normative evaluation and the state to remove the wretched from us. And that's certainly not what Fanon is asking to happen, right? But nonetheless, that's what happens in our academic and disciplinary language, right? So we reconstitute the anthropology of Western man, of white men, of white society, of white women, because we pretend that the relationship that white men and white women have had to each other, which is one of violence, also constitutes the relationship that poor men and women, black men and women, colonized men and women, right, have to each other. So then the call for decolonization isn't the destruction of the Western world. In many ways, it's the assimilation into it. The same kind of distance and removal that we wish to have from those wretched, violent brutes that threaten us just as they would threaten white society. So while the wretched still exists and endures within the geography of the neocolonial order, it's precisely the wretched that poses interpersonal violence and threats, while the constituting violence of the social order, right, Western democracy, American democracy, capitalism, pick your poison, is the one that one wishes to assimilate into to become safe, and then it fades to the background of the world. This is actually what Gramsci means by hegemony, and Kano later as to the dangers of hegemonic masculinity, but also the immediacy of the danger posed by criminals and deviants, which insists that the non-hegemonic, non-patriarchal, wretched male must be controlled and sanctioned. So whereas decolonization as a method will be the destruction not simply of the world, but the modalities which order it, we are left dependent on the apparatus of the human as the architect of alternative possibility. So if racism is, as I've defined in The Man Not, a complex nexus, a cognitive architecture used to invent, reimagine, and evolve the presumed political, social, economic, sexual, and psychological superiority of white races in society, while materializing the imagined inferiority and hastening the death of inferior races, or where racism is simply the manifestation of the social processes and the concurrent logics that facilitate the death and dying of racially subjugated people, then the architect of the racist world is culpable for the form presented as social, the ideas that materialize in the world. And one of the central aspects here is, how then do we reconstitute the modality of the human? My suggestion is really very simple, that the brute, or that which is savage, has always been an enduring feature of Western society. I don't think anybody who does psychoanalysis or psychology would even argue that. But when we place that feature within our modern democratic society, and that feature becomes racialized men, who we ourselves are afraid of, the analysis stops. We're not asking why the extension of ethnological science in the 19th century, or the language of even feminists from the suffrage movement, people like Phoebe Cousins, who suggested that as men, black men are more brutish than white men because they learned from slavery how to treat their women. We don't ask, well, how has that replicated in the 21st century? We cut off our analysis. But then when you see the political movements of freedom, you see the constant extension of phobia. In every century, you see the constant extension of the space that man-nots, alien men, outgroup men occupy. You see the arbitrary set discrimination. You see it with the racialization of Muslims after 9/11. Now, is it right? We can see empirically all these things, yet we appeal to the universal. And we pretend, and this is where the political is interesting to me, we pretend that the choices we make, that the rhetoric we make, the identities we claim in trying to disown violence as woman, as queer, as immigrant, etc., is not reconstituted when we appeal to have the same world of the white bourgeois human that's already removed from those groups in the first place. We're not eliminating the conditions that breed the wretched or the brute. We're not eliminating the genocidal and dehuman decontextualizations that create man-nots, or racial misandry, or violence, or police incarceration, etc. We simply ask that they are removed from the world. And imagine then what mechanisms have historically been used to do that. So if decolonization, if critical thought merely throws us back on the apparatus of Europe to move us away from what we take Europe created, we're in a kind of circular process where appeals to the political always seem to reify not only the aspiration of anti-black racism, but the architecture and the creativity, the possibility that's given to us in the human. How am I on time? Oh, wow, okay. All right, well, let's continue. So Zygmunt Bauman expresses a similar concern regarding the conceptually othered or new poor, which result from the rise of global capitalist structure that supports and enables the institutional validation of the knowledge produced by universities as useful and the products of students as labor. In Legislators and Interpreters on Modernity, Postmodernity, and Intellectuals, Bauman, while not specifically speaking to anti-black racism, remarks that today's intellectuals, while they feel and express pity for poverty, refrain from proposing to marry their thought with this particular variety of human suffering. So Bauman interestingly describes this as a consequence of rationality and the seeming dispositions of subjectivity. He continues to explain, all in all, pity takes the place of compassion. The new poor need help on humane grounds. They are unfit for grooming as the future remakers of the world. With historiophilosophical indifference comes disenchantment with poverty. Being poor once again seems unromantic. It contains no mission. It does not gestate future glory. Psychologically, if not logically nor historically, it appears residual, marginal, and alien. So Bauman's explanation of poverty mirrors the concerns for the poor black male that's been raised by Huey P. Newton as a problem of thought, or raised by Sylvia Wynter in No Humans Involved, right? This idea that because you are poor, because you are black, because you are male, there is no conception, there is no existential validity to that position. You are unthought, undesirable. There is nothing to futurity that you contribute. Now, I actually think that this is a mark of an anthropological difference in my work. My suggestion is like, you're absolutely right. Wretchedness does not lend to futurity because in death, there's an expansion of the now, of the present. But nonetheless, this is still an anthropological break from what we think of as the human. Our calls for decolonialization make it imperative, right, that we eliminate practically all forms of European anthropology. Futurity is one of those. This is why Europeans engage in racism proleptically, which means they think of the future in the now, because they understand that because they are a powerful racial group, that they are gifted futurity, that they can think 2, 3, 4 generations, and they can exterminate people in the now for the future. But then we come about with a political, and want to participate in a political process that is based in the future as if we're them, when we're constantly dying in the now. And this is the contradiction of politics with philosophical anthropology, right? This is the problem that I constantly find in reflecting over and over and over again about the continuity of death and dying within racial populations, sexual violence and rape within racial populations, and then their resolution within white populations. Because within white populations, you can change morality, you can change politics, you can change laws. But as Calvin Warren says, there is no political that offers change for a people that's beyond being, that has blackness that has no metaphysical content, right? So Wynter demands a reformulation of our popular academic understandings that account for how we explain discourse as actively cultural. This reformulation is not critical in the traditional sense from which discourse, language, knowledge is legitimated or semiotically relevant in specific social, cultural, historical contexts. But language is cultural in that discourse bursts, gives legitimacy to, and symbiotically regenerates social cultural environments, reconfirming the problem of white knowledge internalized by the learned Negro. So similar to Carter G. Woods' miseducation of the Negro, Wynter highlights the dangers of asserting power, recognition, knowledge, all constructs emanating from the concept of man birthed within the matrix of white supremacy as inapplicable to blackness generally, and black male life more specifically, and others more broadly. It is through thought that what becomes understood as thinking flourishes. This codependency of thinking and established thought, its valorizations, is at odds with the rupturing of our temporal consciousness and projections that we name as politics. So I'll end with this. So perhaps our failure of theory or our philosophy or whatever critical mode you choose to label that process of engaging power, you know, I'm hesitant to call it critique, you know, given because I don't really like Foucault that much, and I'm half-hearted on Butler. But imagine, for instance, if critique is in fact the persistent struggle, right? Trying to pull back layers of power, if it's an onion, just peeling and peeling and peeling. What happens when that power resolves? So then so if you take away the obstacles that you claim power doesn't allow you to enjoy, can you trust the human that is operating to not reconstitute those very same hierarchies? So you get rid of man, you get rid of patriarchy. Can we really trust that femininity won't reconstitute its very same role? Is that not the function of what we claim? That there are normative valuations, what we want politically, right? Somehow redistributes power and class, etc. But it never changes the philosophical, the anthropological hierarchies that we see persisting throughout our societies. That may, in fact, that we call normal, just parts of human civilization. And notice that this is not about exclusion. We're not just leaving certain people out of social organization where we can include them and now it's a nice liberal democracy. This is saying that in the democracy there is a space of nullification and negation that has for centuries been revolved around not humans not being savage animals, right? So as David Smith says, right, dehumanization is like psychological lubrication. It makes the unthinkable against certain bodies possible. There is a zone that's full of lots of psychological lubrication, despite our claims of freedom. And we can't get access to that. Maybe it's because we don't want to. Maybe it's because we don't have an interest. Maybe it's because we don't get paid in the academy to do so. But then how does all of our critique, all of our engagement, all of our fancy flourishing, be you psychoanalytic or et cetera, get to that which is already constituted in the idea of the human? And that's what I'm trying to resolve. That we see the persistence historically, we see it descriptively. We could argue that it's part of evolution. We could argue, as Miller does, that it's a function of distributions of power within states. And then we're left with this other problem. Well, once we've identified it, what kinds of values or sentiments do not replicate it? And that's the problem that I'm having with how we think of normative philosophy, normative political theory, and ultimately what I find to be the problem with political antinomies. So thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, so if you have questions, please line up over here. We're gonna start the Q&A session. Wow, what a powerful paper. I want to start with kind of a general question about your theoretical journey that led you to establishing Black male studies, and sort of like how you became dissatisfied with intersectionality, and like what's the story there?
That's a long story. I'll give you a Cliff Notes version. When I was in college, I was part of the debate team. I feel like a lot of our interviews start with that because it was such a formative basis of my introduction to theory. So there was, at that period of time, there was no real issue with people. There were no arguments against feminism. The idea was clearly, off in the 1990s, women were underrepresented. I mean, this is before intersectionality even caught on, because this was in the mid-1990s, so it wasn't even popular then, right? And you had bell hooks, you had these interventions of Black women doing Black feminism, and I took tons of feminism classes. Like, you look at my transcript, there's just hours and hours of feminism on it, because I was genuinely interested in this problem of gender and sexual violence. But then I got to grad school and something changed. I was in, I never forget, I was in this Black feminism class, and we were talking about Janet Jackson and Nipplegate, with I think Justin Timberlake. Yeah. And I asked, I said, there were some reports at the time that she was in on it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I asked what I thought was a simple question. I said, well, if she engineered this so that there's a certain representation of her body being shown to the world to break, because it's taboo, right? In the Freudian sense, taboo, so to speak. Then does she not play a role, right? Does she not, right, have this same kind of similarity of mindset as we're claiming that Justin Timberlake does? And there was just so much, like, how could you say that? And I'm like, I guess it shocked me. It shocked me to see that we have all kind of accounts of bourgeois men that work alongside patriarchy. We have all kinds of accounts of like white women who are racist, but even then they're somehow still resisting patriarchy. And the idea that a rich Black woman couldn't commit any violence, I thought was strange. And it wasn't just that, it was that there could not be a question of it. So throughout the class, I would ask questions about Black men. Well, what about Black men who are victims of rape and violence, etc.? There was this way that they don't exist, and even if they did exist, it's not important. So I went through my master's program. It's not a big deal. I just thought it was strange. After I finished my PhD, I wrote on Derek Bell. I wrote on critical race theory. I started presenting at conferences. People would get upset. They were like, "This is too radical. This is not philosophy, etc." I said, "Okay." But then one day, I gave a paper that tried to discuss Thomas Foster's article, The Sexual Abuse of Black Men Under Slavery. And I went to a conference, and I was booed by a Black feminist. And the reason I was booed was because I was told that this takes away attention from real victims. And I'm thinking, my God, this is slavery. I mean, aren't they all victims? They're all enslaved. And after I started giving that paper a few more times, I gave it 2 or 3 more times, there was one or two more conferences where black men came up to me. They told me that happened to me. And at first, I'm like, okay. I didn't know how to really respond. I wasn't studying it that much. I thought I was making kind of a historiographic point. And after it happened the second time, I said, maybe this is something we need to talk about. So I started trying to have conversations about the rape of black men, both in slavery and in society more generally. And that's why when you read that chapter of the book, you can see that it starts with slavery and then moves to like police brutality and other things. And the amount of resistance I got for introducing the idea that there is a historical link between the sexual exploitation of black men during slavery and Jim Crow and the way that they are raped as young boys and the police today was so immense that I figured that I actually had to write a book about it. Because it was caricatures, it was vehement attacks, it was everything. It was everything. And this is not all coming from black feminists. I don't want to give that impression. But I mean, this is coming from black feminists, from white liberals, from white feminists, et cetera, right? And I guess that what I saw was that there was no way to talk about the kinds of vulnerability that racialized men have in a society. And then that immediately made me think that, well, then there's an ignorance that we have on our part. Because we see it in the background. We see black men getting shot almost daily in this country, right? We see migrant men being killed. Think about how desensitized we are to it. Because when we see those pictures they show of men, usually with children or with women, floating in rivers, right? It inspires nothing. So I started questioning, well, then what is it about these groups of people that seems to nullify any kind of human compassion or sentiment? And I started writing about it. I started looking for resources. I ran into social dominance theory. I ran into Earl Miller's work. I actually ran into Adam Jones's work on gendercide. And I was like, okay, well, people have done this, but then why no discussion about sexual violence and rape? And I started combing through archives, combing through different, small pieces, like Grimke's piece in 1913, where he has like 3 sentences saying that, given how white men rape black women, can we think it impossible that 1 out of, say, 1,000 white daughters would do the same thing to a black slave, right? These things started generating different sorts of questions. And I guess after 2 or 3 years of reading this all day, I said, well, then why don't we have a field to study this? And when I tried to introduce this under intersectionality, immediate resistance, right? No, this black men have privilege. And it was always privilege, privilege, privilege. I said, well, what about vulnerability? And then vulnerability only comes about from the racial category. There is no sexual vulnerability. There is no rape. So the mutilation, the cannibalism, the lynching, none of this seemed to fit within the realm of the sexual. So I said we needed a different rubric. And I started developing black male studies really as a way to humanize and talk about the different kinds of suffering that racialized men deal with. And I think that I had more confidence in that finding after I discovered the rape of Jewish men during the Holocaust. Because when you study black men, there's a tendency for you to feel crazy, right? Because just kind of how they're viewed. So when you study black men, no matter what you say about them, if it's not that they're pathological, you're a hotep, you're caping for black, there's some kind of euphemism for why you shouldn't engage in that study. But then when I found this in Jewish and Armenian men, I said, well, look, there seems to be a structure here where we keep saying there are men and women in society and there's a class antagonism between the two, but in every single society, genocidal, modern capitalist, et cetera, there's this other category of not men. And this endures, right? Then, and I try to figure out, well, then what are the characteristics of this? What is it about this category that stops us from understanding how the society operates? And then I said we needed to find a way to diagnose it and start looking into it.
Pretty much there was no space for the conversation and you had to create one with the book, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what I did. But you never know if you succeed or fail at those things.
So given your shift that you just mentioned, kind of thinking in a global sense about genocide, right? Mm-hmm. I'm curious about the question also of international solidarity among the wretched or the oppressed, especially as a political question. Mm-hmm. Do you think about that from that? I do, but this is going to sound so pessimistic, almost cynical. I think that one of the problems that we have
within our time frame as intellectuals is that we use the political to extend the present. And here's what I mean by that. When we see faults in our society or around the world, we assume that our society and the world is so elastic, so benevolent in such a way that it could correct itself without ending. And I guess because I read the intellectual history of the 18th and 19th century, this is a very new idea. The idea that civilizations could adapt to problems and not die is extremely new. And I guess now I'm wondering, given the faults we have in civilization, is the role of the academic to rationalize the extension of a decadent world? And again, I know that sounds cynical, but what if it's the case that the reason these things happen is because our way of thinking, our epic, what we take to be the pillars of our civilization, actually just have to die away? And what then if the ways that we rationalize it through saying democracy can fix it, or compassion can fix it, all things that I think are fine within human societies, but nonetheless, do they repair civilization? I'm not sure. Maybe the flaw of capitalism is the mistake that's going to kill Western civilization. Maybe genocide, maybe anti-blackness is the thing that's going to kill Western civilization. Perhaps these things are not accidents, and I think that we don't anticipate a time where we don't exist. In future generations, and I mean, the recently past century, there was the contemplation that there would be a time where certain races and groups of people didn't exist, right? That's why genocide was an answer for people like Hitler. That's why colonization was an answer for people like Josiah Royce and Great Britain, because they said these people have no worth. And I'm not saying that we should engage in genocide or anything like that to hasten that, but what if there are fatal flaws in the way that we've constituted our time? That means that our time, ourselves have to pass away, and perhaps reason is merely trying to extend that. Maybe it's just trying to resuscitate something that can't be fixed. On the other hand, does solidarity give us something within our lifetime to look forward to? Of course. But I don't think that the question of whether or not political solidarity around migrant labor, genocide, sexual violence, etc., is an end of those practices itself. Because it's people with power, it's labor, it's racism, it's dehumanization that create a nexus that allows people to profit off of the extermination and the suffering of others. And if that's a feature of human society, then perhaps we have not yet evolved to a period of time where it's not.
Thank you. There's a gentleman with a question. Please use the microphone.
Excuse me. I just want to sort of follow on your question just now and then what you just said. So I'm a retired Army officer, U.S. Army officer, and Guantanamo defense attorney, and have a lot of concerns for the state of the world today, because we have been at what the DOD calls a perpetual war, meaning it's never going to end, the Department of Defense, since 2001. Mm-hmm. And so we use these same techniques that you're discussing regarding gender, racial analysis to exclude, other people all the time when we're prepared to attack them. Mm-hmm. And we're always preparing to attack some other group. Right. It went from the Iraqis, the Libyans, the Syrians, the Iranians, the Chinese are in line, the Russians are in line. Mm-hmm. And so we're always making these plans. And so we condition the people to prepare them for war. Because we don't want them against us like they were with Vietnam, but rather we want them for us. So we want them enthusiastic for killing a new group. Mm-hmm. And we constantly, talk about us being a benevolent country, Western civilization being benevolent, ignoring that vast history of how from the very beginning of colonialism we excluded the other, meaning those barbarians that the explorers would find in these far-off countries. And I use the term barbarians, that's how the Europeans characterize them. Yes. To legitimize the fact that while the law of war was beginning to be developed as a humanitarian way of fighting wars, at the same time they didn't want to impede the explorers who were going out and stealing resources, etc. So they excluded the indigenous people that they were encountering from the rule of law, from the law of war, because they were different. They were barbarians. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm just sort of rambling here, but
no, it made perfect sense.
But to your discussion regarding how we use femininity maybe against black males, we do the same. So we attack Muslims by saying, well, they don't treat their women right.
Oh, absolutely.
They make them wear hijabs and other things like that, all to condition the American people that these people are less than human. They have to be attacked.
Absolutely.
And so we do that repeatedly. And so I don't know if you want to address that issue a bit in some way or other.
Yeah, that's just a historical fact. I mean, Louise Newman has a nice essay on how women's rights have always been used for colonial purposes. And this is what I meant when I said there are modalities of being that constantly replicate themselves. So I think about this seriously. If we say women should be free, then does that justify the extermination or militarily engaged people that we've oppressed for centuries? Iranians, Muslims, pick your group. How do we, this is what I meant when I say normative valuations always run back into the anthropology that we claim we're trying to retreat from. So we don't want to be oppressors, but to get our political point through, we're willing to oppress somebody. Right? So I think that when we talk about women's rights, when we talk about economics rights, human rights, civil rights, etc., this is what I think Fanon and other decolonial or anti-colonial theories are trying to make us aware of when we talk about development, etc. That you're never going to get away from appealing to the state or appealing to white supremacy or empire, whatever you want to name it, for the resolution of the conflict you want politically. So then we have political solidarity to be recognized within law. We have civil rights, we protest, be recognized by a system that inevitably is productively violent, right? We say that we want to end sexual violence, but then we have no problem with sexual violence being committed by women because, hey, feminism is not about that. It's about female victims, not perpetrators, right? We're always going to reproduce some harm. So is our process of thinking critically just nullifying people or numbing people to the harm we don't want to see? And I think that's what inevitably happens. So even when I talk about racialized men being feminized, the issue is we feminize all kinds of groups that we think are barbaric. And the feminization comes about because we think in patriarchal, civilized societies, the split between men and women, while unequal, is nonetheless civilized. We objectify white women. We don't make them wear, heavy burqas, right? We're not doing that. So what do? We use the women that are oppressed within the Western world as the standard for why we should treat Muslim women this way, even though it's fundamentally unequal, but our civilization is better, so let's go invade. And we have no resolution to how silly that is. We just say it should be done. And I know academics who make this argument. The whole Bring Back Our Girls campaign. We're against militarism, we're against imperialism, right? The state is violent, patriarchy, etc. Oh, but go ahead and intervene to bring back the young women. Ignore the fact that 50 or 60 young black boys were killed, but bring back our girls. And then this one, as an academic, I'm supposed to say, yeah, that's the political issue of the time. So let's use the military to invade an African country to destroy rogue black men and women who we call terrorists because that doesn't fit our Western sensibilities. Those deaths are not allowed. The deaths in our country are allowed, but those deaths are not allowed. Right? What are we doing? And that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that as a political issue. I'm saying, what are we doing with the political? Do we just strategically deploy power and imperialism when it benefits our side? Do we yearn to be in the human so that we control the mechanisms of power? Do we frame women's rights and gender inequality, same-sex rights, as being protected by the system rather than exterminated by it? And this is one of the fundamental questions that I'm asking in my work, because I'm confused as to how white women, who are the second richest group in the United States and the world, right, depending on how you break up ethnicities, but certainly in the UK and the United States, talk about patriarchy in such a way as they want to destroy it, but nonetheless benefit from it paternalistically so that they're not eliminated like racialized groups are. Right? Like, what are we actually seeing as diagnoses of the human, of capitalism, of racial capitalism, of racial logic? And I think that we're being dishonest. Because I think we could take any snapshot in history and see that there are these kinds of atrocious, genocidal logics that revolve around racism, that specifically target males in certain instances, but yet we want to remain blind to that because it doesn't fit our philosophical and theoretical postures.
Thank you. Do you have a question? Go ahead.
So thank you so much. I'm sitting with so much.
No, please.
No, in pretty good ways, I think. But I think I'm reckoning with the ways that Black and Indigenous and immigrant feminisms have created so much.
Yeah.
And I don't think that you disagree.
No, I
with
don't.
That.
I don't
so
know.
what I'd like to hear is how we move towards a creation or a bridging, or how can Black, Indigenous, immigrant feminisms, right, that I believe are the true, like what I think to be feminism. How can this get bridged with your model? Because it's so on,
Sure.
and maybe you've already said it and I got like lost in
No,
it.
you haven't.
But
I think it's a great question.
yeah, do that for me.
So here's the thing. When I talk about feminism, I'm because of the histories that I'm working with, I'm really talking about an evolution of the thinking from ethnology in the 19th century to the 20th century, and then this is my argument that what we know is kind of the subculture violence theories. My argument is that where Farrakouti and Wolfgang left off, Black feminism picked up. For me, that's that's a specific history. But when we're talking about indigenous feminisms and we're talking about what indigenous women and racialized women have historically created, I just don't term those feminism, right? So there is no incompatibility with women's liberation and what I'm talking about. Because here's the difference. Before we started labeling things feminist, right, which didn't happen until the 1970s, because there was no word, like even white feminists had not yet separated women from the unit of family, right? We're still talking about family studies, the role that women play in reproducing culture, right? We're having all these debates. Black women, indigenous women, et cetera, are already developing political strategies based on that. And one of the recognitions, and I'll give you a very concrete example of this, one of the debates in Black family studies that you're having in the 1950s and 60s, as well as Africana womanism in the 80s, is precisely about the role that patriarchy plays in divesting Black people from humanity. Because what these women said was that, look, you're saying that gender matters, but you're saying that our gender operates in a way and in a hierarchy that's universal. And I've always found this strange because even when you read like the introduction of Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, she makes the claim that there is no universalization of patriarchy. It doesn't exist in all contexts. And the problem that they have as feminist theorists is they keep marrying women to a patriarchal context as if that's the meaning of the word. But indigenous women are not just dealing with that, right? Black women are not just dealing with that. Women of the global south are not just dealing with that. Because at the same time that they're dealing with colonialism, et cetera, they're dealing with white women who come in to rule over the native. So there is not the same shared womanhood that we use to kind of sustain the category of feminism. You see what I'm saying? So the indigenous ways, the radical ways, the Black ways, the socialist ways, the Marxist ways, right? All this stuff that we have revolving around the intellectual histories of the women of darker races is completely compatible. The only thing that I think is the disagreement with how we think of feminism now and what I talk about in terms of the way that Black women resist is around the category of gender. Because if you adopt second wave feminists, or even if you adopt this intersectionality, you say that there is going to be a gender hierarchy, what I call a gender essentialism, which is that men are always over women. But then when you look at coloniality, that's never been the case because white women were introduced to darker races as the ruler of darker races. So it can't sustain the universal context. So I think that would be the difference, right? I see no contradiction. I think that because feminism has become the term that people have preferred to name these kinds of practices, that when there's a criticism of feminism, it's like, well, what about these other things? But to me, they fall outside of the specter of the evolution that we're talking about. I think Black feminism is different because when you started talking about subcultural violence theories, like, mention Amir, Browns-Miller, et cetera, you have a translation in Bell Hooks' work from the ideas that Black men are savage, brutal, rapists, into this explanation of how she sees patriarchy operating in the Black community. So whereas people like Brown Miller, Mitchum, Ferracuti, and Wolfgang are saying, well, look, violence is valorized. That this is how poor black men communicate. Since they don't have social power, they communicate through violence. That idea gets translated into patriarchy. And that's why I don't think that it moves away from that specific colonial or neo-colonial model of how you explain the violence of the brute. In terms of how we look outside of the geography, I think it's an issue of terminology and why we frame things within Western discourse.
I think also the distinction that you write about in terms of genre and gender,
yes.
that's helpful too.
Yeah, I mean, at a very basic level, and I know that this is provoking in a certain way, but savage people didn't have genders under Western ethnology, and ethnology was the dominant science from basically the 1800s to 1940 or 50, depending on where you're stopping today. If you stop with Boaz, so for the life of me, I can't figure out what made gender suddenly evolve within savage peoples. And the only thing that I can trace it to is this idea of integration. You said when you integrated these people, they took on the dominant traits of the human, which is white taxonomy. And I have such a huge problem with that because we don't, one of the differences now is when you read philosophers from like the turn of the century, they're always talking about poetry and historians from the century before them, right? When you read philosophers and theorists today, they talk about today. They talk about hashtags. They talk about the most popular theorists of whoever's. And I don't understand understanding the world that way. I don't understand trying to understand the world through a snapshot. So if we're serious about why we're different from these Western peoples and these groups that colonized and murdered us, the difference is that we did not see the same modalities of being the way that they did. Our notions of the human have different possibilities and anthropological ends than the European or Western man does. And because of disciplinarity, we often fight with each other over which term, which politics, who's more violent, who's more decadent. So we see liberation in excluding ourselves from the people we don't want to be. So if we think that the black man is violent, then everybody in the academy says we're not like that, those poor black men. I don't want to defend those poor black men. I don't want to defend those Latino migrants. I don't want to defend Mexican men who are drug dealers, et cetera, et cetera. We ask no questions as to why they're that way, right? And I guess that's my frustration, that we fight over terminology and the ethics of labels, right? The impetus we think labels get us in some magical political world instead of the actual history that created difference. And that's not turning a blind eye to the violence in our communities. It's saying that the violence in our communities does not originate in some sort of ontology of our people or of these men, rather the environments and the context that you put them in.
Any other questions? So basically, the category of gender is anachronistically used.
Absolutely.
Right? That's
because we're using it to read trends and histories backwards, right, where those trends and histories were fundamentally denied. Right? Like the idea that everyone could be racist. The racism existed because there was a superior race and inferior race. Inferior races couldn't conquer superior races. Right? That's why we had wars, right? Or non-race, yeah, or non-gender, right? Same thing. So, how we interpret these histories are vastly different.
Yeah, that's great. So I was thinking about maybe hierarchy as a better word than patriarchy. And I was thinking specifically of like Hillary Clinton, Carly Fiorina, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, and Eric Holder are all good white men now. And it's like, so it is an artificial construct and that...
Yes and no.
Okay.
Okay, so you have to take a step back with me. So women are patriarchs within 18th and 19th century theories of race, because race has evolved in such a way that only civilized races could have gender distinctions. All right, and here's what this means. So if I'm a white race and I'm evolved, that means that I've moved from the passage of savagery, where I now know that we're not animals. So by moving to that level, I now know that men have a certain role and women have a certain role. And from that, that's how I build civilization, churches, homes, etc. Okay? So in that rubric, right, people like de Gobineau, people like Jules Michelet are arguing that savage races are all feminine. So even the male of this race is feminine compared to the woman of this race, because this is a patriarchal race, this is a feminine savage race. Now this goes all the way up to like the 1940s and 50s, right, until they start trying to separate gender. So in that world, patriarchy is not just a construct, It's a marker of racial civilization, right? In that world, that's why you see white women doing the exact same thing as everyone else. That's why white women were imperialists, white women colonialists, et cetera. So Hillary Clinton fits fine within that model, right? There's no contradiction. If you're talking about bourgeois black people, like Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, et cetera, yes, they're elites, but one of the things that made elites from the late 19th and early 20th century is that they had assimilated or evolved to have the same kind of class distinctions as white people. So they fit in that category precisely because they've adopted the same kind of taxonomies, politics, economic structures, et cetera, as white people. Now you fast forward to now. Because we have these rigid constructs of identity, it doesn't feel natural to make those kinds of arguments. So when we say Condoleezza Rice or Colin Powell, we want to step back because we don't feel comfortable even calling women patriarchs, right? Everybody says they are. Connell says they could be hegemonic, et cetera, but there's something intuitive in us that doesn't allow us to jump over that gender brigade, right? Because now we associate patriarchy so strongly with male sex, even though we say that it's socially constructed, that we just can't see women occupying that because of our time frame, okay? I don't think that it's artificial in that way. What I do think is artificial is the way that we use sex to stand in for hierarchies of power. So we say, by definition, all men exist within this hierarchy, people don't. But in reality, vastly different groups of people can move on the side of the dominant racial group. And once they do that, they take on patriarchal power. So if patriarchy is defined, as I argue it, as the subjugation of alien male groups, then you could see someone like Condoleezza Rice, you could see someone like even Bell Hooks participating in that activity if we think that's one of the groupings in a patriarchal society. So the same way that you would say that a woman who sides with men over women as a group or sexual violence is on the side of patriarchy is the same way that you can say that a woman, black, Indian, Muslim, whoever, that does the same thing about subordinate men could be on that side. Or if they participate in militarism, or if they believe in colonialism, et cetera, right? So I think we have to do a better job of understanding what patriarchy is, right? Because it's not an empty hierarchy. It's a specific kind of hierarchy that's trying to reproduce very specific ends and aims endogamically. If we understand what that is, then we can assign who's trying to do that more, right? Or who's doing that in our society. But if we're stuck with, and this is Miller's point, if you only use sex as the way to understand that hierarchy, then you can't explain someone like a Condoleezza Rice or a Hillary Clinton. Because your view is, well, women are by definition outside of that. And that's just not how the world works. That's not how systems of power work.
So we'll end on that note. Please thank Dr. Tommy Curry. We have a short break, and then at 6:30 we have some Pueblo dancers from Santa Clara who are going to be performing for us. Right here. Yeah. Right here. I think the response was good too.
No, I thought, yeah.
Judith Butler as Judith, and I also
Yeah, I'm contemplating.
I'm like, meh.
No,
I was like, meh. But like,
I understand
she
that
says
somewhat.
the same thing. She's like, we fucked up by putting
Yeah.
women with feminism. And I'm like, yeah. And then when you're saying that, and I'm like, ooh.
Right.
But I'm on board with it.
Right.
And I appreciate it.
No, but that's
I
the
want
thing,
to
it's
read
like,
your book.
no, look, I just want to have a conversation because I think it's something that I care about. But I found that too, is that, people would say, oh, well, you're making these arguments and you're misogynistic. And I was like, well, basically, Judith Butler made the same argument about the five.
She's a white queer person.
Yeah, she's a white queer person. I was like, you can find some of the stuff that when you ground her argument.
Well, sure. I guess I'm saying there's like social equations.
Yeah. But then if that's, this is what I meant about the ratio, right? If I can't speak about my own group, then it means that we're always up.
Well, I think where I was able to tie all the components together was when you really brought it into a conceptualization of masculinity. And that's so powerful. And then it just like, I think let my own defenses go in a way, I mean, not that you should have to do that, right? But I was like internally processing like the hour-long conversation.
But that's, my issue is, why is it that violence seems so extreme and also right? So, it's not like I can look at women and say, yeah, women are not victims of sexual violence. No, I know, we're not saying that. But I mean, like, in terms of, like, this argument that I have to do, it's like, what really is going to, I'm asking that, like, so, am I going to just, Daniel, don't forget the center mics.
I don't know. Oh, yeah, I can hear. That's yours. Test. I don't need the water though, but just leave it there.
Do you need anything else?
No, that's it. Yeah, they're whenever they're ready. Come on. No, they should be fine. Oh, nice. Perfect.
So many psychologists that forget the social actually do that. Yeah, minds are individual. We're social. Yeah, we're psychosocial.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's the point we even mentioned when your chapter. Are you guys ready? Psychosocialization versus the psychological.
There's no such thing as there's psychologization.
Psychologization.
Which is always reductive.
Or yeah, it's reductive.
Also, this is t-shirt for you. Conference t-shirt. And she didn't come? No, but she probably watched it. Yeah, she can watch it.
So we're ready.
Okay. Shall we start in like 4 minutes?
4 minutes. Okay.
I'll ask everyone to.
Okay.
Rachel. Yeah. You ready? Yeah. Okay. Well, Rachel's going to introduce.
Do you want me to just start then?
Yeah, so we're ready to start, everybody?
Good evening, Sengi-hung Ya'ate. My name is Rachel Begay. I am a full-blood Native American from the Pueblo of Santa Clara and the Navajo Nation. I am the administrative assistant to the Humanities, Social Science, Language and Letters Department here at Northern New Mexico College. Before I begin, I would like to mention that I work with a group of talented, knowledgeable, friendly, and all-around awesome faculty members in this department. This evening, I want to share with you a little bit about my Pueblo, as well as today's conference with a performance of one of our sacred dances. There are 19 pueblos in New Mexico, and each pueblo is a sovereign nation, meaning that they are a body of land or reservation under their own tribal governmental structure. We all have similar belief systems, spirituality, and lifestyle. Santa Clara is a Tewa-speaking pueblo and is located along the Rio Grande River, 1.5 miles south of Espanola. Puye Cliff Dwellings is the ancestral home to the Santa Clara people. The cliffs are a historical and archaeological landmark located in the mountains above the modern-day pueblo. For more than 3 centuries, this spectacular locale was home to over 1,500 people who built villages, farmed the land, hunted game, and of course, inhabited the cliff dwellings. Eventually, drought caused the springs to dry up and crops to fail, forcing the people to make their new home along the river. However, these traditions continued within the pueblo, which is located 10 miles east of Puye. The name Santa Clara comes from the Catholic Saint Clare. When the Spaniards first tried to rule over the pueblos, they built churches, giving each pueblo a patron saint. The traditional name for the Santa Clara Pueblo is Hapo Owinge, translating to singing water. At one time, there were many natural springs all over the pueblo. Today, we still have the creek that runs through the pueblo and is always singing, hence the name Singing Water. The translation for Puye Cliff Dwellings is Buckskin Village, named because of its abundance of elk and deer that were hunted in the nearby canyon. The Santa Clara people, as well as many indigenous tribes, have preserved many of their ancient traditions. We all share a history of oppression and injustice, but our identities have not been faded, even in the face of multiple colonizing nations. Today, as always, we value our uniqueness and traditional way of life. At the same time, we live in modern houses and work and reside both on and off the reservations. Our beliefs and actions are still guided by our core Pueblo values, which include respect, compassion, faith, understanding, spirituality, peace, and empathy. We continue to participate in our traditional celebrations and ceremonies throughout the year, maintaining our deep connection to our communities, to our ancestors, to nature, and Mother Earth. Santa Clara takes great pride in its rich legacy of pottery making, which is one of the most widely collected forms of Pueblo pottery. Mr. Eric Tafoya, the drummer for the dance group, is a well-known potter for his distinct handcrafted black and red ware, which are decorated with intricate, precise engravings and designs. In addition to pottery, our Pueblo has many notable painters, embroiderers, drum makers, and weavers. Some of the techniques used today are thousands of years old. Since time immemorial, Pueblo communities have celebrated seasonal cycles through prayer, song, and dance. Those dances connect us to our ancestors while honoring gifts from the Creator. They ensure that life continues and that connections to the past and future are reinforced. They are not selfish prayers. We ask for guidance and blessings for all people throughout the world. Although we may not all look alike or the same, we are all brothers and sisters. This evening's performance will be presented by the dance group Tewa Sunrisers of Santa Clara Pueblo. The group is led by Mr. Eric Tafoya, who is the drummer, his son, daughter, granddaughter, and my son. What you're going to witness is called the buffalo dance. Normally, it is performed toward the end of the winter season to honor the animals that have given their lives to feed us, give us warmth, and clothe us. The dancer's regalia is made from parts of actual animals. Our ancestors also learned to spin cotton. As you will notice, the kilts and dresses are handmade.
In closing, we hope that you have enjoyed this dance and leave with a small understanding of who we are as a Pueblo people. This dance is dedicated to you with our blessing to send you on your life's journey for happiness, harmony, health, and prosperity. Thank you.